Here in the studio, Trita Parsi is the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. Joining us from Philadelphia, Michael Johns is the co-founder of the National Tea Party movement. Also with us, Eleanor Clift is a political analyst for the Daily Beast, and from London, the former advisor to the Russian government, Alexander Nekrassov. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us. Trita, let me start with you. So heated rhetoric on both sides, from the Iranian side, from President Trump as well. It's a Twitter war so far. Where do you see it going?
I don't see it going any place particularly good, because at the end of the day, even if Trump actually does have the intent of going back to the table, there's several reasons to believe that it's going to be much more difficult to be able to pivot to diplomacy after these type of tweets and this language than it was in the case of North Korea. First of all, when it came to North Korea, the other allies of the United States, and as well as competitors such as China, they favor diplomacy and they strongly oppose the military confrontation. In the case of Iran, allies in the region such as Saudi Arabia and Israel have very much opposed diplomacy and have also favored military action. And they have influence in this city, and their ability to undermine any such pivot, I think, is quite formidable. Moreover, North Korea is a one-man show. He has the flexibility of being able to just turn on a dime, whereas the Iranian political system, certainly not a democracy, but the power is dispersed within the elite, and it's very difficult for them to be able to make shifts of this kind without paying a heavy political price. Iran has politics in a way that I don't think North Korea does.
And those politics that you talk about in Iran, could there be a situation where President Trump may want talks with the Iranians? He may want to resolve this nuclear deal in some other way, but there could be a split in Iran. One faction might want talks, other faction might say, no, we're not prepared.
Certainly that has been the case in the past, and right now, mindful of how the JCPOA has played out and how the U.S. has withdrawn from it, those arguing in favor of talks with the United States and Iran are definitely on the retreat, because the last example of actually engaging with the United States ended up with Donald Trump killing the deal. So those who really put their name on that initiative are not in a great position in Iran right now. And this is part of the difficulty. If Trump truly is interested in diplomacy, this is not the way to do it with the Iranians. If he thinks that he's building up leverage by imposing new sanctions, etc., that's the same thing the Obama administration did. And what did the Iranians do? They aggressively expanded their nuclear program. So by the time the two sides met at the table, both of them had extensive leverage.
Michael Johns, what do you make of this sharp exchange of tweets, shall we say, between President Trump and President Rouhani?
I think we're at a crossroads, clearly, in U.S. policy toward Iran. The agreement that President Trump removed us from was flawed in many respects. He ran on campaign pledge to get out of it, and has fulfilled that promise. Additionally, I think he's legitimately pointed out that Iranian support for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for the Shiite militias in Iraq, their cyber crimes and cyber attacks against the West and other countries, and their presence in Syria. All of these are really significant issues. And then you add on top of that their inflammatory rhetoric, which I suppose he matched with that tweet. But the reality is Iran is still carrying itself as an enemy. And I think he makes a reasonable point that's embraced by the American people, and that is that if we're going to have an agreement with Iran, it should include a legitimate and broad description of how we're going to interact as peaceful nations toward each other. Finally, I think that you see in Iran a country that in many respects is on the edge. Its economy is beginning to be under a great degree of pressure, in large part because of the U.S. sanctions. And the Iranian people, which President Trump was careful to distinguish we continue to support, is increasingly frustrated and irritated at the Iranian regime, and protests are beginning to arise, et cetera, which has given, I think, rise to the question of how stable the regime is.
Eleanor, President Trump has sought a meeting with President Rouhani twice, according to the Iranian media. What are we seeing here? Is it posturing that is directed primarily to President Trump's base, showing the base what he can say to the Iranians?
I think, first of all, this president wants to undo everything his predecessor, Barack Obama, did. I mean, you can almost, do a checkbox. Every signature achievement of President Obama, this president is seeking to undermine. Now, the Iran nuclear agreement had the support of America's allies, plus Russia and China, and they all want to stay in it. It had a limited objective, which was a substantial objective, which was to curb the nuclear program. Fine, keep that in place, and then get a treaty about ballistic missiles, or build it through diplomacy. Instead, this president has just chosen to walk away from the deal, to blow it up. And yes, it does fulfill a campaign promise, but the president does what feels good to him. He rarely has any kind of concrete plan of action in place. And I think his notion of how you deal with other countries is you squeeze down on them until they cry uncle. And if the economy gets bad enough in Iran, I think this president is convinced the Iranian leaders will come crawling to him, which does not show much cultural understanding or understanding of history. And I think what's going on right now is largely posturing, but posturing is what led to 2 world wars in the 20th century. And you don't want to, it's like playing with lit matches on Twitter. And so I think he's getting a lot of pushback from foreign policy circles in this country, but his base of supporters thinks it's great. He's fulfilled another campaign promise, and the Iranians are doing all these terrible things, and so we should punish them. It's a very sort of black-white view of how you handle diplomacy.
All right, let's go to London and bring in Alexander Nekrassov. Alexander, of course, these issues that we are talking about, the nuclear deal, Syria, 2 of those issues, Russia has played a significant role in those issues. How is all that is taking place here in the United States and Iran being looked at by Moscow?
Well, first of all, I think that Putin and Trump did discuss Iran during their summit. And I think that in one sense, the Russians understand that what Trump is saying on his side is for his domestic audience, and what the Iranians are saying on their side is for their own domestic audience. I think that the real diplomacy and work will have nothing of it. And I think that the Russians will play a key part in the New Deal and helping this New Deal to come alive, so to speak. And I don't really think they're surprised, because the Russians are basically getting used to the way that Trump operates. Don't forget that every American president during his first 2 years, if you remember the Clinton 2 years, it was a total disaster. There was even talk then that he might not last till the end of his first term. So, he's still settling in, as the Russians see it. And Putin's summit with Trump, it basically convinced him that he can deal with Trump. They can actually work together. They understand each other to a certain point, and they can pull off surprises, as we saw in that summit. And I suspect that they probably will be meeting in the end of September, the General Assembly time. And that would be a good time for everyone to start meeting, and maybe the Iranians will be there as well. So I suspect the Russians will be playing a much bigger role in this New Deal with Iran than the previous one.
Trita, there have been some, let's say, unusual developments concerning the U.S. relationship with Iran. Just this past weekend, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, addressed a largely Iranian American audience in California. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
The regime's revolutionary goals and willingness to commit violent acts haven't produced anyone to lead Iran that can be remotely called a moderate or a statesman. Some believe that President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif fit that bill. The truth is, they're merely polished frontmen for the Ayatollah's international con artistry. Their nuclear deal didn't make them moderates, it made them wolves in sheep's clothing.
So, Mike Pompeo, very critical there, but why to an Iranian American audience? Have we seen that before?
First of all, the majority of the people there were not Iranian Americans, even though this was in LA, which is a place that's not particularly difficult to fill the room with Iranian Americans. But I think it's part of the administration's strategy, similar to what we saw during the Bush years, in which they wanted to give the appearance that the Iranian American community, just as much as they try to give the appearance that the Iraqi community was in favor of this belligerent foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran that the administration is now pursuing. without a doubt, a lot of the rhetoric that came out of Pompeo at that meeting, pointing to all of the very negative actions of the Iranian government, particularly when it comes to internal repression and corruption of the regime, is things that the vast majority of the Iranian American community would agree with. They share that frustration. In fact, their frustration is extremely deep. But I don't think he succeeded in translating that frustration vis-a-vis the regime into support for Trump's policy on Iran. On the contrary, I think it frankly backfired, because he was trying to give a softer face, saying we care for the Iranian people, and then just hours later, Trump's tweet comes out, which is very belligerent, and particularly if it's talking about going to military confrontation, we're talking about thousands of Iranians being killed. So I think it really did backfire, but it is an attempt to give the impression that this is a policy that actually has the interest of the Iranian people at heart as well.
Michael Johns, what's your view on that?
I think the Iranian exile community has actually been very supportive of this transformation and adjustment in U.S. policy priorities, and has embraced it. But ultimately, U.S. policy toward Iran has to be about America and American interests, not about accommodating a foreign constituency or a constituency here. And I think the president very clearly has placed U.S. security interests at the pinnacle of that list of priorities. Those clearly were not addressed in what President Obama did with Iran. It's correct to say that this agreement, there were a lot of hope in the past administration that it was going to kick off a new season in U.S.-Iranian relations. In fact, that relationship became even more hostile, and Iran became even more aggressive, used the funds that were transferred back to them for the purposes of that end. And ultimately, I think the American people and President Trump correctly saw that this is not heading in the right direction.
Trita?
Well, I mean, if we take a look at the polls, the Iranian American community overwhelmingly supported the JCPOA. They wanted to see an improved relationship because they do believe that ultimately reduced tensions with the United States gives the people of Iran inside more space to do what only they can do, which is to push the country in a democratic direction. This is not something that Washington can do. Only Iranians inside the country can do so. But the enmity between the United States and Iran, sanctions and all of these things that put so much pressure on the Iranian people actually set back those efforts. So they were strongly in support of that. And I've seen absolutely no evidence that there's any particular support for the Trump administration's approach to this, particularly when you take into account other measures, such as a travel ban that he imposed, which primarily affected Iranian Americans more than any other nationality. These are not measures that in any way, shape, or form has won the Trump administration any support in the Iranian American community. But I think Matt said something that, U.S. national interest has to be at the center, and I agree 100% with that. And that's actually precisely why it's so perplexing to see that the administration has done this, because Secretary Jim Mattis said we should stay in the nuclear deal. Tillerson said we should stay in the nuclear deal. McMaster said we should stay in the nuclear deal. The only people that actually in the administration have been pushing for this line are, similar to what Eleanor said, people who had almost an obsession of undoing anything Obama did. That has nothing to do with U.S. national interest.
Eleanor, now the United States wants to reimpose those additional sanctions on Iran. Secretary Pompeo, at that very same meeting that we talked about, also addressed that issue. Let's watch that part of it.
We have an obligation to put maximum pressure on the regime's ability to generate and move money, and we will do so. At the center of this campaign is the reimposition of sanctions on Iran's banking and energy sectors. As we've explained over the last few weeks, our focus is to work with countries importing Iranian crude oil to get imports as close to zero as possible by November 4th. Zero.
Can the United States do that?
Well, oil is a global market, but there are ways that they can kind of throw sand in the gears. And I think this is timed. We have midterm elections in this country, and being tough on some foreign interventionist country is good red meat politics, and I think the president is creating an enemy here. But I'd like to return to the fact that the president of Russia might well be in Washington in the lead up to the midterms. The president has gotten a lot of pushback from his own party on that. The congressional wing of the Republican Party is really in a revolt because it just goes against all of their policies over a period of time. So now the talk is that maybe Mr. Putin would be here after the midterms to view a military parade that the president would oversee, that the president has been wanting ever since he went to France and sat with President Macron and saw their military parade. So how that will play politically, I mean, I can't understand today's Republican Party anymore, and I don't think the Republican Party fully understands President Trump, but he has a strong hold on the voters who support him, and apparently nothing is going to shake that.
Okay, Alexander, let's move on to the Helsinki summit. No sooner had tempers cooled here after that infamous news conference in Helsinki, President Trump announced, as we heard from our reporter, that he wants to invite President Putin for a visit here to Washington, to the White House. You know, we hear the United States president being derided here. You know, he's been severely criticized from some quarters for that meeting with Putin. But how does it look like, what does it look like in Moscow? Is this something of a diplomatic coup for President Putin? Has his ratings gone up?
Well, of course, Putin looks well from this summit. And everybody pointed out that he looked sort of cool and calm and won on political points. But I think that this was a major surprise for everyone in America when Trump invited him so soon and during that storm that was continuing after that press conference. Now, that in a sense, I suspect was a surprise for Moscow as well, because it came so quickly. They did talk about meeting each other after, during that summit, and there was an idea of an exchange of visits with Trump going to Moscow at some point. But the thing is that in Russia, what they don't understand is that a few months before any election, even this one in November, which is not that crucial in some ways, but it's still an important, very important election for Trump, they understand that things can happen that you can't predict, that you can't foresee. And they think that the whole the strategy of Trump and his team at the moment is to win that election. So they're ready for any surprise, and they're taking things as they come.
Eleanor, on that prospective visit, there was a curious exchange between a United States television reporter, Andrea Mitchell, a well-known reporter here, and Dan Coats, who is the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. This took place at the Aspen Security Conference just a short time ago. Let's watch part of that exchange.
The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again?
Vladimir Putin coming to the...
Did I hear you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be special.
So we can hear the audience laugh there, but it's not a laughing matter, is it?
No, it's not a laughing matter, but it seems in the realm of absurdity that after all the criticism the president got for being too cozy with the president of Russia, that he would immediately turn around and say, oh, let's have a second summit. And the New York Times did some interesting, what we call TikTok, about that. And the president was very frustrated at the negative reviews he was getting for the Helsinki summit. And so his pattern of behavior is he then doubles down. And so he called his national security advisor, John Bolton, and said, I want to invite President Putin to Washington, make it happen. So nobody else was told. John Bolton evidently went ahead and made the appropriate calls or cables or however you do that. And the director of national intelligence, Dan Coats, was completely out of the loop. And it almost did sound like it was a joke. You wouldn't think that this was what the president would be doing to combat the negative reviews he had gotten. But this is what this president is very good at doing, and that is changing the narrative very quickly, and it has everybody chasing off of a new storyline. And there are a number of people in Washington now who think that as some of these investigations heat up, that he's going to continue to look for more distractions. And he has an endless supply of them, apparently.
Michael, very quickly, I've just got about a minute left. I mean, how does one explain this? Did the president just forget to tell his director of national intelligence that he's inviting Vladimir Putin to Washington?
No, I think you had the DNI subsequently clarify that he didn't really expect to have been previously consulted on that. It's an issue of a matter of state visit, not really a matter of intelligence. And the issue is you had in Helsinki a reasonable first discussion, I think established some degree of personal rapport,
right,
and now an understandable inclination to have a more substantive discussion on the policy issues that confront U.S.-Russia relations.
Okay. Trita, just one other issue I want to get to before we close, and that is Syria. The Syrians must have watched the summit in Helsinki very closely. Both Russia and the United States said they want a quick end to this conflict, which has lasted about 7 years now. Where will that leave the Iranians? They're involved in Syria as well.
It is a complex issue at the end of the day, but what I think is quite fascinating is the role that Russia has played. And one of the things at the end of the day we have to give the Russians a lot of credit for, they have the capacity of both saying yes and no to almost every actor in that theater, including the Israelis, including the Iranians. So in some ways, they may actually be the only ones right now that could work out some sort of an arrangement. I'm not talking about the internal situation in Syria. I'm talking about the very dangerous dynamic that currently exists between Iran, Syria, and Israel and Hezbollah, and be able to find some sort of a compromise that stabilizes that part of the world.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.